How does an innocent person end up in jail? We know that it happens. For example, the United States Registry of Exonerations recorded 161 discovered wrongful convictions in 2021 alone. That's one country, and those are only the official numbers. Worldwide, the tally will be many, many times higher. But why does it happen? Well, there can be many reasons, but one paradigm that arises is when strange behavior is interpreted or misinterpreted as consciousness of guilt. Before I go further, you might think, well, somebody who behaves suspiciously after a serious crime is obviously guilty. There's no smoke without fire, right? But actually, misplaced feelings of guilt and consequent behavior can be more common than you might think. For example, let me ask you this. When you're walking through airport security, do you feel this nagging sense of guilt, even though you haven't done anything wrong? As though you'd fail a lie detector test right then and there. Or if you go to the supermarket and you don't find what you're looking for, do you feel this urge to grab something, anything, just to avoid walking out with your hands empty? These strange behaviors can be everyday, but in the worst cases can land innocent people in jail for crimes they didn't commit. My career has been focused on criminal justice, from the district courts in New Zealand, dealing with drunk driving cases, through to the international courts in The Hague, working on genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. I've seen pretty much the whole range. And one thing I've learned is that evidence is the lifeblood of the law. You can't convict someone based on suspicions alone, and you wouldn't want to. But what is evidence? Well, legally, evidence is anything entered onto the record in order to prove or disprove a claim. That could be your statements, your diaries, your online searches, even the incognito ones. But what about conduct, activity after a crime? Well, that, in many systems, can also be introduced as evidence of consciousness of guilt. At times after a serious crime, the stakes are raised, the pressure on the police is intense to secure a conviction. But these are precisely the times at which the risk of misinterpretation is at its highest. And we know that mistakes are made. For example, we have the case of Amanda Knox, who you see here. She was convicted for the murder of her roommate in Italy when she was on exchange in 2007. What was interesting about her case was her apparently aberrant behavior. She did gymnastic moves at the police station during interrogations. She was embracing her then boyfriend and co-accused right beside the scene of the crime within hours of it being discovered. And most significantly, she named another man, her former boss, Patrick Lumumba, as being responsible for the murder, despite the fact he was completely innocent. He had a rock-solid alibi. She was eventually exonerated in 2015, so it turned out she wasn't guilty of the murder. She was convicted for malicious accusation against Lumumba. So there we had misinterpretation of admittedly strange, suspicious behavior factoring in to a very serious and wrongful conviction. Sometimes it goes even further. People, due to this consciousness of guilt, might plead guilty and confess to crimes that they're not actually responsible for. We have an example that you see here of Marty Tankleff. When he was 17, he came home to his house in Long Island, New York, to find his parents viciously stabbed, bleeding to death on the floor. The police considered that he didn't seem grief-stricken enough, and they fixated on him as the primary suspect. He actually confessed to the crimes after the police used a ruse where they told him that his father had miraculously survived and had named him on his deathbed as the murderer. So he thought he must have blacked it out. And he spent 19 years in prison before it was overwhelmingly demonstrated that he was not, in fact, guilty of that crime. Wrongful confessions are more common than you might think. One advocacy group has found, with over 100 cases of people exonerated, that a quarter, 25% of them, had confessed to very serious crimes despite not being responsible for them. And in experiments, researchers have found that people, particularly in vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, are susceptible to admitting guilt for something they didn't do. So one example, the researchers used a keyboard and they said, "Do not hit the Alt key or it will crash the computer." They then artificially prompted that and then interrogated the participants and accused them of having done so. What was notable was amongst the youths, over 50% were willing to plead guilty. Amongst 12 to 13-year-olds, it was 80%. And interestingly, even when they were told that it was a construct and that it was an experiment after the fact, some of them insisted that they actually had hit the Alt key. So guilt is a very strange thing in our minds. But what actually is guilt? Well, its definition is a form of emotional distress based on the possibility of being morally culpable or being perceived as morally culpable. And that's important. You don't need to be guilty to feel guilty and therefore potentially to act in a guilty manner or a guilty-seeming manner. We know that in many cases, this pressure from guilt manifests in very serious ways, but also in the everyday. For example, if someone you know tells you unfortunate news, the death of a relative, for example, you'll say, "I'm sorry," despite the fact you're not responsible for that event. I know for myself that if somebody tells me an unfortunate fact, if I don't say I'm sorry, I feel guilty for not apologizing for something that I didn't do. And this is actually called a superfluous apology. What's notable about it is despite the fact you're not guilty of anything, people giving those superfluous apologies have been found to actually experience guilt. So there's a somewhat irrational operation happening there. There's also a social side to guilt, to the expression of guilt. We know that it has a function in society of acting as a conduit between authority and the individual. The English philosopher and social theorist Jeremy Bentham used this in his design of the panopticon. You see this here. It was a prison design with a central tower for the guards surrounded by cells of the prisoners. What was important here was that the prisoners could be under surveillance at any time, but they didn't know if they were actually under surveillance. And through this, they could self-regulate, and it wouldn't require many guards to actually run a whole prison. The French theorist Michel Foucault expanded on this idea and theorized that throughout society, we have a panopticon which is invested in all structures, all hierarchies, not just the prison system, but education, social life, family life, etc. And in modern times, we carry around a pocket panopticon with us at all times. Most of you probably have one now, of course, a cell phone. Now, cell phones have come a long way. We see here the 1951 Harwell Decatron. This is the oldest, still working digital computer. Now, this computer could do 8 to 10 transactions in a second. A modern phone can do 11 trillion in the same amount of time. It can follow your movements, it can have a pretty good idea who you've been in contact with, and to a certain degree, can anticipate your very thoughts. With this increased data and power at our behest, there come consequent dangers. And one of them is that as we're exposed to increasing amounts of connections, available information internationally, the space for what is considered appropriate behavior actually narrows. By consequence, Anything outside that narrow space is considered strange, deviant, transgressive, and possibly even suspicious. We know that context plays a big role in interpretation, even at the neural level. So for instance, we have Edward Adelson's checkerboard illusion here. And square A is a dark square, square B is a light square, right? Well, if we change the context subtly, we see they're actually the same shade. So context actually changes the way information imprints itself in your neural pathways. When it comes to criminal justice, this is very important. And it's important to know that behavior that actually may be innocent, normal behavior, seen in the wrong context and misinterpreted, may result in innocent people going to jail. So what do we do about this? Well, I have 3 suggestions. The first is that we invert this risk of data and we use it to our benefit in the penal system. So for example, juries, they shouldn't throw away their intuition. They should keep using their natural human reasoning, but we can augment that, we can complement that with objectively verifiable data, whether it's CCTV footage, whether it's satellite images, or otherwise. We keep connecting the dots until the picture's clear, and only then do we put someone behind bars. Secondly, with this almost ubiquitous availability of data, we have to jealously guard our human rights. Privacy, freedom from arbitrary interference are more critical than ever. We know that these rights, like trust, are hard won and easily lost. And they disappear, sometimes imperceptibly, slowly, like the proverbial boiling frog. And you only miss them once they're truly gone. Finally, at the personal level, I would beseech all of you to take it easy on yourselves. Stop feeling guilty about everything. You're not serious criminals, at least I hope you're not, so don't treat yourself like one. Next time you're walking through the airport security, take a breath, relax, and ignore that anxiety. That's just thousands of years of human evolution masquerading as consciousness of guilt. Thank you.